Chapter 23. The children in Stamps trembled visibly with anticipation. Some adults were excited too, but to be certain, the whole young population had come down with graduation epidemic. Large classes were graduating from both the grammar school and the high school. Even those who were years removed from their own day of glorious release were anxious to help with preparations as a kind of dry run. The junior students who were moving into the vacating classes' chairs were tradition bound to show their talents for leadership and management. They strutted through the school and around the campus, exerting pressure on the lower grades. Their authority was so new that occasionally, if they pressed a little too hard, it had to be overlooked. After all, the next term was coming up. And it never hurt a sixth grader to have a play sister in the 8th grade or a 10th year student to be able to call a 12th grader Bubba. So all was endured in a spirit of shared understanding. But the graduating classes themselves were the nobility. Like travelers with exotic destinations on their minds, the graduates were remarkably forgetful. They came to school without their books or tablets or even pencils. Volunteers fell over themselves to secure replacements for the missing equipment. When accepted, the willing workers might or might not be thanked, and it was of no importance to the pre-graduation rites. Even teachers were respectful of the now quiet and aging seniors and tended to speak to them, if not as equals, as being only slightly lower than themselves. After tests were returned and grades given, the student body, which acted like an extended family, knew who did well, who excelled, and what piteous ones had failed. Unlike the white high school, Lafayette County Training School distinguished itself by having neither lawn, nor hedges, nor tennis court, nor climbing ivy. Its two buildings, main classrooms, the grade school and home economics, were set on a dirt hill with no fence to limit either its boundaries or those of bordering farms. There was a large expanse to the left of the school, which was used alternately as a baseball diamond or a basketball court. Rusty hoops on the swaying poles represented the permanent recreational equipment, although bats and balls could be borrowed from the PE teacher if the borrower was qualified, and if the diamond wasn't occupied. Over this rocky area, relieved by a few shady, tall persimmon trees, the graduating class walked. The girls often held hands and no longer bothered to speak to the lower students. There was a sadness about them, as if this old world was not their home, and they were bound for higher ground. The boys, on the other hand, had become more friendly, more outgoing. A decided change from the closed attitude they projected while studying for finals. Now they seemed to read, not ready to give up the old school, the familiar paths and classrooms. Shh. Shh. Only a small percentage would be continuing on to college. One of the South's A&M agricultural and mechanical schools, which trained Negro youths to be carpenters, farmers, handymen, masons, maids, cooks, and baby nurses. Their future rode heavily on their shoulders and blinded them to the collective joy that had pervaded the lives of the boys and the girls in the grammar school graduating class. Parents who could afford it had ordered new shoes and ready-made clothes for themselves from Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward. They also engaged the best seamstresses to make the floating graduating dresses and to cut down second-hand pants which would be pressed to a military slickness for the important event. Oh, it was important, all right. White folks would attend the ceremony, and 2 or 3 would speak of God and home and the Southern way of life, and Mrs. Parsons, the principal's wife, would play the graduation march, while the lower grade graduates paraded down the aisles and took their seats below the platform. The high school seniors would wait in empty classrooms to make their dramatic entrance. In the store, I was the person of the moment, the birthday girl, the center. Bailey had graduated the year before, although to do so he had had to forfeit all pleasures to make up for his lost time in Baton Rouge. My class was wearing butter yellow pique dresses, and Mama launched out on mine. She smocked the yoke into tiny crisscrossing puckers, then shirred the rest of the bodice. Her dark fingers ducked in and out of the lemony cloth as she embroidered raised daisies around the hem. Before she considered herself finished, she had added a crocheted cuff on the puff sleeves and a pointy crocheted collar. I was going to be lovely, a walking model of all the various styles of fine hand sewing, and it didn't worry me that I was only 12 years old and merely graduating from the 8th grade. Besides, many teachers in Arkansas Negro schools had only that diploma and were licensed to impart wisdom. The days had become longer and more noticeable. The faded beige of former times had been replaced with strong and sure colors. I began to see my classmates' clothes, their skin tones, and the dust that waved off pussy willows. Clouds that lazed across the sky were objects of great concern to me. Their shiftier shapes might have held a message that, in my new happiness and with a little bit of time, I'd soon decipher. During that period, I looked at the arch of heaven so religiously my neck kept a steady ache. I had taken to smiling more often, and my jaws hurt from the unaccustomed activity. Between the two physical sore spots, I suppose, I could have been uncomfortable, but that was not the case. As a member of the winning team, the graduating class of 1940, I had outdistanced unpleasant sensations by miles. I was headed for the freedom of open fields. Youth and social approval allied themselves with me, and we trammeled memories of slights and insults. The wind of our swift passage remodeled my features. Lost tears were pounded to mud and then to dust. Years of withdrawal were brushed aside and left behind as hanging ropes of parasitic moss. My work alone had awarded me a top place, and I was going to be one of the first called in the graduating ceremonies. On the classroom blackboard, as well as on the bulletin board in the auditorium, there were blue stars and white stars and red stars. No absences, no tardinesses, and my academic work was among the best of the year. I could say the preamble to the Constitution even faster than Bailey. We timed ourselves. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. I had memorized the presidents of the United States from Washington to Roosevelt in chronological as well as alphabetical order. My hair pleased me too. Gradually, the black mass had lengthened and thickened so that it kept at last to its braided pattern, and I didn't have to yank my scalp off when I tried to comb it. Louise and I had rehearsed the exercises until we tired out ourselves. Henry Reed was class valedictorian. He was a small, very black boy with hooded eyes and long, broad nose and an oddly shaped head. I had admired him for years because each term he and I vied for the best grades in our class. Most often he bested me, but instead of being disappointed, I was pleased that we shared top places between us. Like many Southern black children, he lived with his grandmother, who was as strict as Mama and as kind as she knew how to be. He was courteous, respectful, and soft-spoken to elders, but on the playground, he chose to play the roughest games. I admired him. Anyone, I reckoned, sufficiently afraid or sufficiently dull could be polite. But to be able to operate at a top level with both adults and children was admirable. His valedictory speech was entitled "To Be or Not to Be." The rigid 10th grade teacher had helped him write it. He'd been working on the dramatic stresses for months. The weeks until graduation were filled with heady activities. A group of small children were to be presented in a play about buttercups and daisies and bunny rabbits. They could be heard throughout the building, practicing their hops and their little songs that sounded like silver bells. The older girls, non graduates of course, were assigned the task of making refreshments for the night's festivities. A tangy scent of ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, and chocolate wafted around home economics building as the budding cooks made samples for themselves and their teachers. In every corner of the workshop, axes and saws split fresh timber as the woodshop boys made sets and stage scenery. Only the graduates were left out of the general bustle. We were free to sit in the library at the back of the building or look in quite detachedly, naturally, on the measures being taken for our event. Even the minister preached on graduation the Sunday before. His subject was, "Let your light so shine that men will see your good works and praise your Father, who is in heaven." Although the sermon was purported to be addressed to us, he used the occasion to speak to backsliders, gamblers, and general ne'er-do-wells. But since he had called our names at the beginning of the service, we were mollified. Among Negroes, the tradition was to give presents to children going only from one grade to another. How much more important this was when the person was graduating at the top of the class. Uncle Willie and Mama had sent away for a Mickey Mouse watch like Bailey's. Louise gave me 4 embroidered handkerchiefs. I gave her 3 crocheted doilies. Mrs. Sneed, the minister's wife, made me an underskirt to wear for graduation, and nearly every customer gave me a nickel or maybe even a dime with the instruction, "Keep on moving to higher ground," or some such encouragement. Amazingly, the great day finally dawned, and I was out of bed before I knew it. I threw open the back door to see it more clearly, but Mama said, "Sister, come away from that door and put your robe on." I hoped the memory of that morning would never leave me. Sunlight was itself still young, and the day had none of the insistence maturity would bring it in a few hours. In my robe and barefoot in the backyard, under cover of going to see about my new beans, I gave myself up to the gentle warmth and thanked God that no matter what evil I had done in my life, He had allowed me to live to see this day. Somewhere in my fatalism, I had expected to die, accidentally, and never have the chance to walk up the stairs in the auditorium and gracefully receive my hard-earned diploma. Out of God's merciful bosom, I had won reprieve.